conference room on the 32nd floor of Sterling Group's headquarters was designed to impress. A polished walnut table stretched from one end of the room to the other, surrounded by leather chairs occupied by board members in tailored suits. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the city skyline, but no one admired the view. Every eye was fixed on the woman seated at the head of the table. Victoria Hayes, the company's CEO, had spent 12 years transforming a struggling manufacturing business into one of the nation's fastest-growing technology firms. She wasn't born into wealth, nor had success been handed to her. Every contract, every expansion, and every difficult decision had been earned through relentless work and quiet determination. Yet on this morning, the achievements that had defined her career seemed to mean nothing. A thick folder was pushed across the table toward her. "Sign it," one of the directors said evenly. "It's in the company's best interest." Victoria opened the folder and scanned the first page. It wasn't a routine approval. The document would transfer key executive powers to a special committee controlled by the very people sitting across from her. If she signed, she would remain CEO in title alone while they made every important decision behind closed doors. "I won't sign something I haven't had my legal team review," she replied, keeping her voice calm. Several directors exchanged impatient glances. "You don't have a choice," another board member said. "The investors expect this today." The room grew tense. One executive leaned over the table, placing both hands on the polished wood, trying to intimidate her with his presence. Another stepped behind her chair as if surrounding her would force her into surrender. The pressure was deliberate, coordinated, and impossible to ignore. Victoria refused to lower her eyes. Fear whispered that she was alone, but experience reminded her that intimidation only succeeds when someone gives in. She took a slow breath, folded the document, and placed it back on the table. "I said no." At that exact moment, the boardroom door swung open. A tall man in jeans and a dark Henley stepped inside, his expression calm but unmistakably resolute. "Hands off the lady," he said, his voice steady enough to silence the entire room. The silence that followed seemed to stretch for several seconds. Every person in the boardroom turned toward the doorway, surprised that someone had interrupted a meeting that was supposed to be private. The stranger didn't rush inside or raise his voice. He simply stood there with the composed posture of someone who had spent years keeping calm in difficult situations. Victoria recognized him immediately. Jake Carter. Months earlier, after the company had experienced a serious security breach, Jake had worked as a consultant during the investigation. Before retiring, he had served as a Navy SEAL, but he never introduced himself by his military background. He preferred to let his work speak for itself. Since leaving the service, he had focused on raising his young daughter and taking selective consulting jobs that allowed him to be present for her. One of the directors frowned. "This meeting is restricted," he snapped. "You're not authorized to be here." Jake met his eyes without hostility. "I was leaving the building when I heard raised voices. I also noticed people blocking the CEO from walking away." He glanced around the room. "That doesn't look like a professional board meeting." Another executive stood abruptly. "Security!" Two security officers entered within moments, unsure why they had been called. Before either could act, Jake addressed them respectfully. "I'm not asking you to take sides," he said. "I'm asking you to do your job. Look at what's happening before you remove anyone." The guards looked around the room. The unsigned documents lay open on the table. Several directors were standing over Victoria while she remained seated. The atmosphere spoke for itself. Jake continued calmly. "If someone is being pressured to sign legal documents against their will, forcing the situation won't protect the company. It will create a much bigger problem." His words weren't emotional or threatening. They were practical. The security officers exchanged uncertain glances and stepped back instead of forward. For the first time that morning, the confidence of the directors began to fade. Their carefully controlled meeting was no longer under their control. Victoria straightened in her chair, realizing she was no longer facing the room alone. Sometimes the strongest form of protection wasn't force. It was the presence of someone willing to speak the truth when everyone else remained silent. The shift in the room was subtle at first. The board members who had been speaking with complete confidence only moments earlier now seemed uncertain. Without the pressure of a united front, each person became more aware of how their actions might appear if questioned later. The silence that followed was far more uncomfortable than the shouting that had filled the room before. Jake remained near the doorway, giving Victoria space instead of taking control of the situation. He hadn't come to fight her battle for her. He had simply interrupted an atmosphere where intimidation had begun to replace proper governance. Victoria rose from her chair, gathered the documents in front of her, and looked around the table. "If this board believes these proposals are in the company's best interest," she said calmly, "then we'll discuss them through the legal process with every shareholder properly informed. But I will not sign anything because I'm being pressured." No one answered immediately. One of the independent directors, who had remained silent throughout the confrontation, cleared his throat. "I agree," he said quietly. "This meeting hasn't been conducted appropriately." Another director nodded. "We should suspend today's vote." The words seemed to break whatever invisible alliance had existed. A third member admitted he hadn't even reviewed every page of the proposed agreement before arriving. Others began asking questions they should have raised from the beginning. The executives who had organized the meeting suddenly found themselves defending their own actions instead of attacking Victoria's decisions. The company's corporate attorney, who had been observing without speaking, finally stepped forward. "I recommend ending this session," she said. "Any decision made under these circumstances could face serious legal challenges." The chairman looked around the room and realized he no longer had enough support to continue. "This meeting is adjourned." Chairs slid back as directors quietly collected their files. Some avoided eye contact with Victoria, others offered brief apologies before leaving the room. Within minutes, the boardroom that had felt like a trap became almost empty. Victoria let out a slow breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Jake gave a small nod. "You handled that yourself," he said. She smiled faintly. "Maybe," she replied. But sometimes all a person needs is one honest voice to remind everyone that intimidation isn't leadership. And integrity is never something worth signing away. In the weeks that followed, Sterling Group focused less on assigning blame and more on rebuilding trust. An independent legal review confirmed that the emergency board meeting had been handled improperly. Several directors had coordinated their efforts in advance, hoping to pressure Victoria into approving changes that would quietly transfer much of her authority to a committee they controlled. Once the facts were documented, the board had little choice but to reject the proposal entirely. A number of executives stepped down while others publicly admitted that they had allowed the meeting to become confrontational instead of professional. The remaining board members voted to strengthen company policies, requiring independent legal counsel to be present during any future discussions involving executive authority. It was a lesson learned the hard way, but one the company would not forget. Victoria returned to her routine with little interest in celebrating. She believed that leadership wasn't about winning personal battles. It was about ensuring the organization became stronger after facing one. During the company's quarterly town hall, she addressed hundreds of employees gathered in the auditorium. "Every successful business depends on trust," she said. "The moment people begin using fear instead of honesty, that trust starts to disappear. Our responsibility is to make sure that never becomes part of our culture." Her words received quiet but sincere applause. Later that afternoon, she met Jake in the lobby as he prepared to leave the building after finishing a brief consultation with the company's security team. "I've been wondering how to thank you," she admitted. Jake smiled. "You already have." She looked confused. "You stood your ground when it mattered," he explained. "I didn't rescue you. I simply refused to ignore something that was clearly wrong." Victoria extended her hand and Jake shook it warmly. As he walked toward the exit, his phone buzzed with a message from his daughter asking if he was still coming to her school recital. His face immediately softened. "Wouldn't miss it for the world," he replied before slipping the phone back into his pocket. Watching him leave, Victoria realized that real character isn't measured by titles, wealth, or recognition. It is revealed through everyday choices, the decision to protect someone without expecting a reward, to speak the truth when silence would be easier, and to return home knowing that integrity is worth more than power.